Pleasure to have you. It's pleasure to have a chance to exchange some ideas with you and do a presentation also on a very important topic dealing with Africana studies. Um, I really enjoyed hooking up with your chair. I have a person that represents me. He volunteers and he's on the chat right now, Brother Ugawa. And he discovered her. And then when he discovered her, he told me her background. I said, give me your phone number. So we've been engaging in discussion because in the academy, you don't have a lot of people who are both activists, organizers in the community, and scholars. And particularly since the 60s, but even in the 60s, that wasn't the normal run-of-the-mill thing. And then as we talked, I found out this is a sister from another mother of another generation that is so much like me, it's funny. And I'm so much like her in certain ways. So in addition to this presentation, we're engaged in collaboration because when I find somebody who's an activist that wants to do something, I said, uh-oh. So this is a real pleasure, and you're fortunate to have her because one of the key things you need in Africana or Black studies is not only scholars, but people who know how to defend a position, because periodically, those that didn't really agree to our existence are going to come after you. And so you better be prepared. In my brainwash days, I was in the Boy Scouts. And the motto of the Boy Scouts is be prepared. And so I know some Black studies that went down the tube because the chairs didn't know how to fight properly. Good scholars, they meant well. And then when they had a fight, they went to court. That's the first thing you don't do. The most conservative, next to the corporations, the most conservative institution in the United States are the courts, with the Supreme Court being the worst of all. And we should know, if it was left to them, we'd still be on the plantation. So going to court, you might get an initial victory, but it's going to be overruled. So you got to go to the streets where your people are. So Brandy, you know, we got us a relationship here. So I think y'all ain't nothing personal here. So don't misread that one. Political, you hear me? And this young lady has got a head on her shoulders. Have you all noticed that? So my topic for this afternoon, evening for you, which I was given by your chair, and leaders are followers. So I follow directions. And some people get topics and they go all over the place. They don't deal with the topic, you know what I mean? But my topic that I was given by your chair is Africana Studies, Teaching Blackness Under Attack, as if that's something new. Most Black people could say, I'm under attack right now too. What's the difference? So this is the overall thing that I'm gonna be dealing with, but not in the way you expect. You expect me to come in and just talk about teaching methodology and stuff. It's my pleasure to have led the only successful Black Power, Black Freedom movement in the North in the 60s to now, the only successful one. We had some successful on some things, you know what I mean? There were a number of those in the North, but across the board success, we did not have. And I was fortunate enough to lead a movement that succeeded in that, and it shaped me. I'm an organic scholar. And what that means is I come out of the community, and that's where my scholarship got shaped. That's when I discovered that I was a scholar, or discovered the path to scholarship. I knew I always liked to read, but I was reading the wrong stuff. You know what I mean? White stuff. Stuff that, you know, I got miseducated on. So it was the movement that birthed me and also allowed me to discover my talents, and particularly as a strategist, as an organizer, and of course, always my love for books. I'm a reader. You see that my library, I see Brandy's. I read all the time. If you're going to be a leader, you better be a reader. You hear me? And I can show you a whole lot of leaders that led their people in corners in part because they didn't read. But not just because of that, they didn't internalize what they read. And so if you got the blind leading people that may be serious, but are counting on you for leadership, they're going to end up in a dead end. And organizing in this country, scholarship in this country is serious business, and especially organizing is. So it was my privilege to be in that movement. And then I never expected to teach at the university level. And when that opportunity presented itself and the FBI was on my tail trying to deny me tenure, they ran a number of COINTELPROs on me, counterintelligence program. You all familiar with that? Nod your head if you are. Yeah, I would imagine you are. So I faced 3 assassination attempts. I faced 2 attempts to take my job. I've never lost a battle. Now, this is what is important to me. I have 3 rules in organizing, the 3 W's: win, win, and win. You hear me? Losing is to me a sin. It's a terrible thing, losing. And I have rules of engagement. I got all kinds of things. So I ain't moving unless, I'm not referring to you, but you're losing. I've already beat you before I engage in battle. And if I can't beat you, I'm also a martial artist. And I know there are fights you can't win. And you never know which one it is. And a good teacher will tell you to avoid every fight you can. And that's what you do. And you don't advertise your stuff or anything else. And then there are certain opponents you're going to look at and say, oh, good luck. So we're also advised to run. That sounds cowardly, but it's better than getting beat up. So it's been my privilege to be able to teach at the mothership of Black Studies, San Francisco State, which wouldn't have happened had the university hired me. The community brought me in. And then when they came after me, Dr. Asa Hilliard was on my HRT committee, and he was the only Black dean at San Francisco State, and my community was behind me. And so I got in, you know what I mean? And I know the FBI was crossing their eyes, saying, what the hell happened? And I said, what I'm going to do is let you pay me to radicalize my people. You understand? Give me vacations, give you retirement, medical benefits, all of that. And my practice was to teach and organize in the community. That's always was my practice, you know what I mean? Because one of the ways in which professors get mainstreamed is, especially activist professors, is they think that when they get into the academy, if they teach something that's positive, then that's enough. But if you're not connected to your community, as Dr. Nathan Hare says, who's the father of Black Studies, a good friend of mine, established the first curriculum for Black Studies, he said the community is the classroom. And if you're not engaged with the community, you'll be like stagnant water and you won't even know it. So a lot of progressive or radical faculty, Black, white, or you name it, have been mainstreamed even unintentionally because nobody really told them what the rules were. And nobody told me either. But I just knew that my first job was in the community. My office hours call me at home because I'm in the community, you know. So, so it was a pleasure. I did not want a chair. I also want to make this point. I didn't go into the university to be an administrator. And I don't want to insult anybody here, but managing departments, that's one of the lousiest jobs you get because you've got plenty of responsibility and no authority. And that is a pure setup for stress. And I learned how to handle that after 1 semester. I won't go through what I learned, but I learned how to handle that. Because my philosophy when it comes to stress is delegate it, high blood pressure, heart attacks, and strokes to your enemies. Don't let it come on you. So anything that's going to be stressful, I've learned how to handle it. So that was not my ambition to chair Black Studies. But once I got in it, I realized the opportunity and I took maximum advantage of it. And I'm sure the system just loved it. So in discussing this topic, Africana Studies, Teaching Blackness Under Attack, I think your chair knew that this is a topic that I would be comfortable with. That's an understatement. I was the terror on my university. I scared the president. I scared the white faculty. Anytime my best friend, who was dean of students and vice president of student affairs, he's passed on now, Penny Saffold, who was an Aries, who was a fighter. She was my buddy. If she wanted to scare white faculty, she'd say, Shaka's coming. Now, I don't know why in the hell she was doing that. I didn't have an army. I'm not going to hurt anybody. I'm a nice person. And especially the president, who periodically, well, once tried to wipe us out. We had a 2-year battle on that. And by the way, I have policies in battle at the university or anywhere else. I treat my enemies with respect. In part, that's our culture. You know what I mean? You're not going to see me name calling somebody, though I've read Hannibal's book. So he would do that to throw a person off, anger them, or whatever. But I've never found that that worked. And I've treated my enemies with respect because your enemy today will be your ally tomorrow or coalition partner. And my objective was not to get rid of a president. Once you defeat him, you know how to handle him. And I don't want another one. I don't know what he's like. And then once I defeat you, I want you to deliver resources to me because I'm going to treat you with respect. You're not going to like the fact that you got whipped, but you got whipped with dignity and with class and with beauty. And that's what really a scholarly organizer is, or just a plain organizer, you know what I mean, in African-American culture. So this topic, Africana Studies, Teaching Blackness Under Attack, I want to divide this into 2 categories. One is the basis for the origin of Black studies, which was born out of the Black freedom and Black power movements and Black Panther movements. And so I want to focus on what the genesis of this is and what it means. So it's going to be a broader framework than just looking at Black or Africana studies. And so that is the first category. And this is going to locate the Black freedom, Black power movement within the context of African history in the United States, starting with the 50s, going through 68, which is the second Black Reconstruction. And so it's within that context because that's the context out of which this movement occurred. We're now in the second post-Reconstruction, but this period was the second Reconstruction. And so I'm going to look at what's the historical background that enabled us to achieve some victories that probably couldn't have been achieved at an earlier period, including the creation of Black or Africana studies. So what were the historical circumstances that we were able to exploit? Because I know my father, who came out of Bunkie, Louisiana, town so small, if you drove through it and closed your eyes, you'd miss it, on a house that was about ready to fall down, and worked a plantation in Orange, Texas, which is, you know, next to, not far from Louisiana. My father was a one-man war machine against this system. His main weapon was his brains and brass knuckles. And he knocked out many a white boy who, because he was light complexion, would use the N-word. He'd knock them out when they came to. He'd say, I'm one of them, buddy. And he cleaned the clock of the plantation owner in Orange, Texas, meaning he whipped the owner's son and was threatened with a lynching, but then was given a job that didn't involve picking cotton. And so my father couldn't do what I did, not because he didn't have the capacity to or willingness to. He was more radical than me from the start, you know, but because the historical circumstances didn't allow it. And so this historical context is really important. And I don't assume that whatever I've done, I did it because there's something special to me. First of all, I didn't do it. It was a movement. But secondly, there was historical conditions that put me in a position, and the movements of the 50s and 60s and 70s and now, even though it's now post-Reconstruction, that could enable us to do things we couldn't do before. And so then the second part of this will deal with then how these movements then contributed to the consciousness that would produce Black studies, first at San Francisco State and around the country. But without these movements, there'd have been no Black studies. So get that straight. And some of the departments of Black studies today that are chocolate studies, brown on the outside and white on the inside, certain administrations have set them up to serve as a buffer and as an alternative to what real Black or Africana studies should be. Since today I'm going to be nice, I'm not going to list them. I think you pretty well know who they are. You know what I mean? I'm not always nice, but I mean, today, I don't want to get off on a tangent here. So the Black freedom and Black power movements were born out of the second Reconstruction. The first one, as you all know, I'm sure, occurred between 1865 and 1877. And it made a lot of gains. I'm only going to focus on a couple of them that are relevant to what we had to pick up in the 1950s and 1960s. The first gain was the right to vote. The second gain was civil rights, secured through a civil rights bill, and then, of course, the 14th Amendment and others that ended slavery. But those were key gains. There were other gains as well. This isn't a discussion on Reconstruction. This is to put it in the context for the topic today. So with Rutherford B. Hayes' election, a Republican, he agreed to the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. Most people don't know he agreed to the appointment of 2 Supreme Court justices from the South that would guarantee that slavery would be restored in fact, though not in name. With that came the ending of the right to vote, terrorism that had been going on since the beginning of Reconstruction. The Klan was rioting the whole time. And contrary to popular opinion, the President of the United States, the government, did not put many federal troops in the South, very few. And so the Klan was free to shoot at you from the beginning. And most Blacks were armed with shotguns. And shotguns can't shoot very far. I'm an ex-Marine in my brainwash days. I do know how to shoot. But shotgun, come on. And these were brothers who won, who fought and in the Civil War and who wanted to defend their people. So we were put in that position. So Blacks became, as Frederick Douglass said, it moved from being slaves of individual slave masters to slaves of society. And so this is the condition of the first Reconstruction. The second Reconstruction between 1955 and 1968, and 68 marks when Tricky Dick becomes president and begins to usher in the second post-Reconstruction. What we see then is the Black freedom movement basically in the South, basically regaining what had been lost in the 1870s. The right to vote and civil rights. Those were 2 pieces of legislation. Our people today have a tendency to discount this, to treat this as this isn't significant. Oh, really? Some of us think that the Black freedom movement delivered full freedom for our people today. And I know some in the younger generation are disappointed, and they should be, fully enfranchised as so-called citizens. But the fact is, this is a relay race. This is not a 50-yard dash. And we're going up against the most entrenched power in the world. So if you expect any movement to produce change all at once and unrealistic, and Brandy tells me one of the things that impresses her about young organizers right now is that they have developed a capacity for a long struggle. They have patience. Now, they have different ways of pacing themselves for patience that I find quite interesting, but that has to do with the conditions they're facing in Black communities, with families being broken up, drugs, death all around them, a society that has flattened everything for the people, creating rust belts for white people, let alone what they're doing for us. So they're coming up under dismal circumstances. And yet, and I'm really proud of all y'all, including you, Brandy, for having the backbone to get out there and do the hard work. And it's not glorious and glamorous, except every now and then you have the big demonstrations, the big movement. Most of the time, organizing is hard work. So the victories that were achieved then, those were significant victories. The Southern Freedom Movement led the way against great odds, because in the South, you faced pure terror. And so anything, a lot of Northern Blacks, I would hear saying, oh, I couldn't do that. It was a peaceful movement. What do you expect them to do? The Montgomery bus boycott, take a gun and walk up and say, give me a seat. You know what I mean? Give me a break. You know what I mean? 97% of Black people stood up against terrorism. And most of these were maids. Most of these were unskilled workers, but it was also the Black middle class. It was every sector of the Black community. 97%. 97% of white people in the history of white people have never done the same thing at the same time. In fact, they're 1/3 people. If you want to understand how power works with white people, understand there will be 1/3 on one side, another third opposed, and another third neutral. Know that. And instead of us always saying, white supremacy, you hear me use the term. I don't use it anymore. I'm using it for the past. White people ain't supreme anymore. Why empower them with a word that tangles you up? And by the way, that ain't your term, that's their term. And most of them like it. Supreme, if you know the ethos of the Aryan, it is power and domination. And being supreme, that's numero uno, the thing that they get greatest pleasure out of. And I find this is across the board. When they get power, they just like doing whatever they want to do anytime they want to do it to you. By the way, the president of San Francisco State, who we whipped after he tried to wipe us out over a 2-year period with the Hoover Institute's support. I was talking to our former dean, Ken Montero, who was dean of the College of Ethnic Studies for about 14 or 15 years. His people are from Cape Verde. He was born here. And he was talking about how my good friend, Penny Saffold, who was dean and vice president of student affairs, how she lived in terror of the fact that she would be removed from her job at any time because he did that with white deans for nothing, just because he had the power. That is the nature of how power is ruled in this, waged in this country and around the world. It's arbitrary. It ain't got no morals to it. It's just based on the love of power. And by the way, that comes from the Aryan or European Greek's first philosopher, Hesiod, who was the author of this notion of power and freedom. It is arbitrary. That's as savage as you get, So the gains that were made by the Black freedom movement in the South were significant against bloody odds, and it represented one of 3 defeats that the white power elite and the white masses who identify with that, because not all whites do, suffered in this country. The first defeat was a defeat during the Civil War. Prior to the Black entry, the North was losing. They only had one victory, Antietam. And they had to wait until that victory came through, because Lincoln was advised that if he announced recruiting Black, ending slavery at that point in places where you couldn't end it. That's what the Emancipation Proclamation was. It was for the South where they weren't going to free Blacks. They said, you got to wait until you have a victory. Otherwise, everyone else will think that this was Ethiopia's victory. Not the Negroes, the Ethiopian. I said, well, at least you got that much straight. So it's at that point. So over 170,000 Black Union soldiers with trusty rifles made the difference. And as one Southerner said in his accent, y'all know, it was when the Negroes entered the war that we started losing. Oh, yeah. Because they got a chance to greet old master and make him holy, put him full of holes. You hear me? And there's some interesting stories where brothers come on the plantation where they had been enslaved and get old master. Oh, what a sad day for you. You hear me? Huh? So that was the first victory. Huh? It was only a victory for us because whites were going to lose without us, but it revealed something about power with Black people. At that point, our power was based on balance of power. And in this particular case, when it was even Steven, in fact, it was inclined towards the South, throwing Blacks in created the balance of power. You hear me? And so a lot of times when we're looking at our power, we need to know its source. And that was a source, a very important source. And so that was the first victory. And of course, Reconstruction for a period of time. But in the 60s, the major victories occurred in the South between securing the right to vote and the passage of civil rights legislation that occurred mainly through the movement in the South in general and through the methodology of King's organization. You hear me? Because they found a method that worked. And that's the key thing in exercising power, is to know always what methods will work. So this was a key achievement. Now, with this achievement, while I hear some Blacks like you all, you would see historically how important this is. A lot of Blacks do. But a lot of Blacks dismiss it as, well, it ain't that much. And they can point out all the negatives they didn't like the call for integration, which was an incorrect call. But King himself, when he called for integration, King was not an integrationist. King was raised in a Black family, in a Black community, in a Black church. He went to Black colleges until he went to graduate school for his PhD, and his advisors were largely Black. And most influential people like Benjamin Mays, he came out of Black culture. King did. You hear me? So a lot of that talk about integration didn't have any substance to it. But by the end of his life, King said he had made a mistake of telling Black people to integrate into a burning house, you know? But it wasn't an integration that he had ever experienced himself, you know what I mean? And as he looked at what you were integrating into, he realized it was pure corruption. And he was opposed to that. So this is key in terms of what was achieved. Now, the main thing is, with the victory that occurs in the Southern Black freedom movement and some victories we had in the North, then what happens is that the right wing in this country realizes that they suffered serious defeat. And if you studied the right wing, you know they're plagued by the feeling of dispossession. And Donald Trump is the main believer in dispossession. Of course, he believes it across the board. If you didn't give him everything he wanted, then, you know, dispossession. But especially with Blacks. And as the new Ku Klux Klan emerges and David Duke becomes one of the formulators of the new right wing, he has to answer a question. How did Black people do this? And he can't believe that we could pull this off. And so he read the Turner Diaries, which is, you know, a major novel for the right wing. And if you watch the takeover of the Capitol, that lynch thing, that was there for the vice president, that comes straight out of the Turner Diaries, you know. And so the writer of the Turner Diaries said, it wasn't blacks that did it, the Jews did it. So, I mean, that's interesting, right? The Jews were barely involved in the Black freedom movements. They provided some financing. There were some. Swerner and Goodwin were both Jewish. They died in Mississippi. They were part of C.O.R.E. Cheney being the other, who was Black. You know, I'm not knocking any involvement they had or any other whites. But the fact of the matter is they didn't lead nothing. You know what I mean? But that is the myth you want to take, because you can't accept the fact that we actually outfoxed you and we whipped you. Because what happened with that Black freedom movement in the South is they came up with some jujitsu and a set of tactics that worked, that produced what they got. And that is no mean achievement, and it shows what we're capable of. So there were key victories that then come out of this movement, North and South, especially starting in the South, because it drove the rest of the Black freedom, Black power, and Pan-Africanist movements to come. The first real victory on the psychological level was the freeing of Black minds. And this is the greatest gain of the movements of the 60s, the freedom of the Black mind. We didn't free all Black minds. I'm not romanticizing it, but I'm telling you, a new mentality came into being as a result of this movement. One of the things that happened with the freeing of the Black mind was that as you engaged the power structure and defeated it, it upped your self-confidence. It upped your belief in yourself. It eroded fear, because fear is a myth. I always tell people, you know, it's the greatest restrictor of human growth and spiritual growth and development, and it's a myth. You weren't born in fear, you're taught fear. Fear God, fear the IRS, fear the FBI. You know, they all do just like you. They breathe like you, they bleed like you, they die like you. What's there to be afraid of? You know what I mean? And so as Blacks went into motion, the fears started going out the window. And in some places like Mississippi, where you want to talk about hell, my grandmother and great-grandmother from Mississippi. And for Black people to stand up in Mississippi, that means you'd stand up in hell, because that's living hell, Mississippi, to this day. And that's why one of our singers had the song Mississippi GD. You know what I mean? Huh? Yeah. And my grandmother told me what they did to Black people in Mississippi. And I was in Mississippi in 1965, working with the Deacons for Self-Defense. And my girlfriend had drove all the way from Berkeley, California. She was chair of Berkeley C.O.R.E, I was chair of San Francisco, Congress of Racial Equality, to see that her man had a nickel-plated 38 Bank of America special with a whole lot of bullets. You know how sisters are. They go see that their man is in the right stuff. I just whipped the Bank of America, the biggest bank in the world. That was the biggest victory in the job campaign. So I figured, my girlfriend's giving me a present. I'm going to actually have this as a symbol of my victory. Oh, no, it was just for while I was there. And by the way, guess what? I'm on the floor in the Freedom House. I think I told Brandy this story already. And the Deacons are telling me how they formed. Deacons for Self-Defense. Y'all have heard of them? Anybody not heard of them? Raise your hand. These were ex-military brothers who came out of the Black church. And it was in Louisiana, because C.O.R.E, Congress of Racial Equality, organized in Louisiana. We organized in Mississippi and other places. C.O.R.E is the least respected of the three groups. We produced the most complex organizing because we organized all over the country. You understand? And so I'm on the floor, and they're telling me how the Deacons came into being. We all got guns. We're waiting for the Klan. The sisters told the brothers to pick up the gun and defend us. Huh? I said, that don't surprise me at all. You know what I mean? And guess what? The FBI never got into the Deacons. They got into the Panthers. They got into a whole lot of groups. They didn't get into the Deacons. Why? Because Southern Black culture drove what they did, and you couldn't get into it unless you had known them for years. They knew who you were. And they weren't on the phone talking nothing. You hear me? And when they came to town, the Klan moved out because they knew if it was a shootout, it wasn't going to go in their favor. So what we see is with the movement of the 60s, there's a defiance that comes to the fore. It was always there, by the way. Note in slavery, as bad as slavery was, as vicious as it was, if you're a historian and you know the history of enslavement, you know this, the tougher we were. And the blacks coming out of slavery were the toughest blacks, the most regal blacks in the Caribbean. They called them poor great, materially poor, spiritually and culturally great. And that's the case with our people here. And they carried themselves with great pride and great dignity with scars. They had scars coming out of slavery. But guess what? Their humanity was intact. They were more humane then than we are now. You hear me? If a black person, Carter G. Woodson pointed this out, that if a black person had a quarter and another person needed it, he'd give it to him. A quarter. You hear me? That's how we survived. Not an acre or a mule, but we had each other. You know, that was the key. So I don't want to treat the 60s as like, oh, we went to a place we never were at before. There were some conditions that enabled us to do that, because we would have done it sooner. In fact, had we been in the Haitian kind of condition, we'd have been doing what Haiti did. It was just a little numbers problem, a little gunpowder problem. That was the problem. It wasn't anything else. And if we got the chance, we took advantage of it. So the greatest gain of the 60s and the 50s and the 70s was the freedom of the Black mind. And that freedom of the Black mind was key to everything else. No Black studies without the freedom of the Black mind. No Black Panther Party. And a Black freedom movement would nurture it, because that's the place where that kind of consciousness developed. King called this the new Negro. Garvey also called it the new Negro, someone who wasn't afraid and who would stand up and who was concerned about something more than themselves. So this was a key gain of the 60s. So one of the key questions is looking at the Black freedom and Black power movement of today, what is the basis for this power that we wielded in the 50s and the 60s and continue to wield today, that could produce victories that couldn't be produced in the 19th century or the 18th century, that could produce a Black Studies department? So what is it that we could do in the 60s and 50s that Blacks in the 19th century or even of my father's generation couldn't do? And so this is a real key question. And in the case of the San Francisco freedom movement, what were those conditions that enabled us to have the chance to have across the board victories? So that's the big question. What changed? And if you think about it yourself, what was different about power relationships in the 50s and 60s and 1890s? Well, one of them is real clear. In the 1890s, white people had white power all over the world, with Britain being number one, France number two. They dominated the world. That was a fact. And America was just getting into the world domination business at the end of the 19th century, engaging in its imperialism, grabbing up the colonies that the Spanish had, Cuba and the others. So that was a period where Africa was under lockdown, Asia was under lockdown, you know what I mean? But it took 100 years to put us under lockdown in Africa. There were wars of resistance for 100 years, you know? And there was resistance all over the world, and they never put China under complete colonialism, semi-colonialism on the borders, you know? But that was the nature of the 19th century. But what happens in the 60s and 50s is you have the decline and fall of the West, of Europe. And so you have World War I and World War II. These two world wars were so serious that they nearly led to the genetic annihilation of white people by white people because they don't like each other. If you look at this war in Ukraine right now, which is America signed off on, the Ukrainians were on the verge of reaching an agreement and the Americans told them to pull out, and everybody says so. The Turks say so, the Russians say so, the Americans said so. And then they later announced their objective to weaken Russia. Well, look at who's being weakened. That country, Ukraine, is being turned into the Stone Age, bombed into the Stone Age. And I'm telling you, when this war is over, America's not going to do a thing to build them back up, you know? So this is a period right now where you see whites, in this particular case, Eastern Europeans going after each other. And Putin was dumb to do this, but Putin's strategy was not to engage in war. His strategy was to get a neutral state in Ukraine. That's what he wanted, you know? And when America decided to, you know, string this thing out, test its weapons, and allow the Ukrainian people to do the suffering, and then their backward leadership went along with it. You know what I mean? You get all this heroic stuff. And then this country's pumping billions of dollars into Ukraine, and they ain't pumping billions of dollars to end homelessness in this country or anything else. You know what I mean? So the thing is, big difference between the 19th century and then the 60s was no longer was Europe the dominant power, no longer. And that particularly is Britain and France and the other European powers. And so as a result, the Caribbean didn't have to have an independence movement. Britain was so flattened out and broke, they had to give it up. You know, of course, they had the common market and, you know, the Commonwealth, which meant I don't see any commonwealth that ever came from Britain. You know what I mean? The wealth is in the crown of the queen and all the goodies she has. You know what I mean? And capitalism, as Eric Williams and From Capitalism to Slavery documented, you know, slavery was the basis for the wealth of capitalism. U.S., Britain, France, all of them, you know? So the thing is, Britain had to walk away because they couldn't hold it anymore. And then in Africa, the same thing. African independence movements could take place. And so in the case of France, they tried to hold it up, but in the end, they had to back out, you know, because again, they didn't have the power. Now, by 45, America emerges as numero uno, supreme power in the world. You hear me? And I won't go into all the missteps and dumb moves that America's made and wrong moves, but Blacks are, you know, as we move within the context between the 50s and the 60s of America as the dominant world power. So what opportunities would that present for us? The biggest one would be that America wants to now play this game of a champion for freedom while they're creating a new colonialism. That's the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, United Nations, which was created for America to control. And but they have to have a pretense that they're not in the old game. So Southern segregation or Southern apartheid was an embarrassment. It's no accident that the Supreme Court is the first to knock down segregation in the schools, and it's the second most conservative institution in the United States. And it has no notion of morality or anything else. It's governed by power. They bow to the powers, but they conceded on this. So Blacks had that maneuvering room. And in fact, the Montgomery bus boycott was settled in the courts, though it was a year-long struggle, would never have been successful, but for 97% of Black people standing behind it. So we had that wiggle room, you understand? Gave us a little wiggle room because this brutal stuff that was being blared on TV every night, dogs being sucked on Black people and everything else, it brought the savagery into the open. It was embarrassing. You know what I mean? You keep it quiet, cool, but out in front, no. But what's the main thing that happens with America? In 27 years, America blew their global leadership. They went into decline after 27 years. Now, how dumb can you be when you got all this power and in 27 years, you blow it? You hear me? So part of what gave us the opportunity to move is that America's engaging in all kinds of bad stuff, Vietnam, South Korea. Most people don't, in North Korea, most people don't know that America's first defeat was in North Korea when Mao Zedong ran the Marine Corps across the 38th parallel. When I was in the Marines, they called that a strategic withdrawal. But in the streets, if you have a gang and one gang runs, the other one won. You hear me? Huh? And that was the first defeat. And then Vietnam. See, the myth of Vietnam was that it was a guerrilla warfare and, you know, hit and run and stuff. But actually, studies that have come out recently show that while in the beginning it was guerrilla warfare, in the end, the Vietnamese won through positional warfare. They put big armies in the field and kicked America's butt as they did in Dien Bien Phu, which was the fall of the French. And the strategy for Dien Bien Phu was planned in the Pentagon. So if the French would lose with an American strategy, what makes you think that America is going to win with an American strategy? Because they wanted to prove that they could knock off a national liberation movement. Can't be done because guerrilla warfare, it's just too hard to handle. So America's decline presented opportunities for us in the Black freedom movement. And by the way, Black people were the first to oppose the war in Vietnam. The first, inspiring other groups of Blacks to go into resistance, something noted by the white power elite. And Malcolm was one of the first, and S.N.C.C to announce their opposition to the war in Vietnam. King's wife, and then later when he took the stand, that was the consequential one that put his head in the crossfires of snipers, you know? So the first reason for the success of the Black freedom, Black power movement, and this also explains the success of Black studies, the ability to insert it up into alien Plato institutions that are designed really to train people to service the system and reproduce the system without any conscience. And the best universities train people for that, Harvard and Yale, you hear me? And they give you plenty of goodies. And what are they teaching you? Neoliberalism. We're going to take everything. I was reading an article in the New York Times where a white woman is teaching a course at Harvard, an economics course. And when you come into the class, it says, our friend, Leo Friedman, our friend. And when they did, Leo Friedman is the author of neoliberalism. And he was somebody that Ronald Reagan, who couldn't chew bubble gum, walk and talk and think. He couldn't think not doing anything else. He had cue cards for everything. He loved Friedman. And if you read a book, America in the 1980s, that's from the Hoover Institute, that charts 80% of Ronald Reagan's agenda. It comes out of that, and it's Leo Friedman. And that's what brought poverty back to America, and it was the key thing that put a stake into the New Deal programs of Roosevelt. And so what happens is a key reason for the success of these movements, Amilcar Cabral explained it this way. The greatest leader, you see him in the back there with the sunglasses on behind me, greatest leader, greatest thinker, greatest organizer in the 20th century, bar none. He's my master that I look up to this day. Greatest analysis, best, most creative analysis of social structure done by anybody. Sociologist, I don't care what, you hear me? And a wonderful human being who maintained a very low casualty rate in his war and for his people, and over 50,000 Portuguese killed, 2,500 people from Guinea-Bissau killed. What kind of genius is this? And he had no military training at all. You know what I mean? Cabral said this, And this is the key to understanding the power that, was a basis for the victories that we achieved. He said, the liberation movement is an act of culture. And then he also said, you measure a people's chance for achieving liberation by the qualitative difference between the culture of the oppressed and the culture of the oppressor. So what happens in the Black freedom, Black power, Pan-Africanist, Afrocentric movements, self-defense movements is these were acts of culture. These were expressions of culture. And one of the main reasons that the movement in the South could be so successful was that it drew from the root of the culture. Coming out of enslavement, we created a new African culture, and it's most solid in the South. Those that are most close to being African are in the South. Those that have tended to be most moral are in the South. Those that tend to be most spiritual are in the South. And while it may appear that they're not the most militant, when they make moves, they're the most effective, because Black people are really careful when they make moves. A lot of us get intellectual and we come up with all kinds of things about what we're going to do to the system and everything else. We're going to free the land and everything else. And Black people look at that and say, oh, honey, that's interesting. And let you try it. They ain't doing stupid. The average grassroots Black person is very practical. You mean land? You mean real estate? Yeah, show me how. But you mean you're going to take Mississippi? Oh, really? Honey, they're talking about taking Mississippi. Father's going to tell his son, don't go to that meeting. You hear me? I don't want to see you up in some Mississippi jail. And then the revolutionaries will say, oh, these are backward people. No, they're smart people. Liberation's an act of culture. So that what happens is the Black freedom, Black power, Nation of Islam, self-defense movements, Panthers, the Deacons, Black studies, Pan-African, Afrocentric movements are expressions of this, with Afrocentric drawing more from Africa, which we need to revitalize the culture, because new African culture, by the way, my definition of this is in the Caribbean, where Africans were a majority, African culture, as Eric Williams said, was dropped in the Caribbean because it's 98% Black. But here, where the overwhelming number of people were becoming white as they became a settler colony that was successful in genocide of Native Americans, the African American culture came under attack. And so we had to go through a very creative bag to recreate it. And I call New African culture a mixture of central principles from Africa with new ones that would serve us here, like race consciousness, like Pan-Africanism, and like a lot of other things. And so this Black freedom, Black power movement was an expression of Black culture. And the key thing that enabled the victories of the 60s was the ethos of the African in America. See, I study the African in America as closely as I study Africa. In fact, more. As I have a saying, it's a poor frog that won't praise its own pond. My favorite pond is the muddy water pond. I'm a blues man. You understand? And I'm a spiritual blues man. I like gut bucket stuff. I like the emotional stuff, that dead stuff. All this la-di-da gospel music that you can't tell from the hit parade, sounds so white, put you to sleep. Only time you know it's gospel is when they put God in it. You know what I mean? I like God. You hear me? Huh? I like that stuff. And by the way, the Black freedom, Black power, all these movements, they were singing movements. Malcolm criticized that. He said, you can't get no freedom singing. You have to be swinging. I beg to correct you, Malcolm. You know what I mean? Huh? When Muhammad Ali got in the ring and said, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, Muhammad Ali, that was poetry. You hear me? And when he tapped you with that fast jab or with that uppercut, and when he did that dance, that wasn't only singing and swinging, it was moving and grooving. Black people, when they engage in freedom, it's an act of culture and it's beautiful. The Black freedom movement was a singing movement. And in Africa, when you went to battle with songs. You had jellies who were the African historians who are talking about how great you were. My mother was like that. She didn't know nothing about Africa. But if I wanted, I never did it, but if I wanted to get a girl to be impressed, I should have brought her to my mother because my mother would praise me to high heaven. My son who's done this and that. But the main thing she'd say about me, my mama knew me. We were in the Bahamas and we're going through shopping in the Bahamas. And my mama is going through, and she was in her 80s then. My mother was one beautiful woman, straight A student, had been an athlete and was a teacher, ran her own academic preschool. She'd gone through the market. And so she's very proud of me. I'm a Leo, she is. We had a lot in common, you know. And she points me out to the market ladies and she said, see, that's my son. She didn't say he's a professor. She didn't say all those other things. She said what I'd want her to say. That's my son. He's a revolutionary. I said, go on, Mom. When I went crazy on this stuff, she didn't even know what it was, but she knew that her son was standing up and she gonna back you up. That's a Black woman for you, not just your mama. You know what I mean? So the Afrocentric movements, the Black studies and Black power movements, they're expressions of Black culture. And these movements were as successful as they were because the ethos of the African American, now I'm going to challenge you because you may question this, but I studied my people very carefully. You know what I mean? The ethos of the white boy is arbitrary power. They love it. That's what they like. I love Castro. I love the Cuban Revolution, but I did not like the way he dominated power. I didn't like it. And that's one reason why the economy is a basket case. It's mainly because of a boycott, but it's also because he didn't allow the people to have the freedom to innovate. And I like Castro, so don't get me wrong. I'm just being critical. I'm critical of myself. I got my shortcomings. Of course, I ain't discussing them here, but I got mine. I know it, you know what I mean? And one reason why I survived is covering them, working on them, because your enemy is going to come at you through your weaknesses. So, because in the formation of African culture in America, which I call New African, we had to go through the souls of our people. We had to draw on the greatest amount of creativity. Our ethos is creativity. It's as natural as a stream of water running. It's as natural as sunrise. It's so natural, we take it for granted. King, in fact, when he was talking about the success of his movement, he said, we got creative and we did some things that worked. That ain't nothing to just say, oh, we got creative and we did some things that work. That's a big deal. You hear me? And I wonder how many people have really figured out what were those methods he used, which, by the way, didn't work in the North. And he didn't figure that one out because his had worked in the South. He couldn't figure, he wasn't in that reality. So creativity was a key reason. And we always were creative. But the circumstances now allowed us to express our creativity in a way in which we could get results. We could get wins. You hear me? And that's the thing. And so the average Black person is a spur of the moment person, but with discipline and freedom. Because when our culture was recreated here, there's a slave narrative where the enslaved said, we think of something African, and we create it on the spur of the moment. And then Dizzy Gillespie, one of our great jazz improvisers and innovators, said that that is spontaneous organization. So if anybody thinks spontaneity is all it is, it's got to be organized. But it comes from the soul. And so the one thing Black people can't predict is Black people. Huh? Am I telling the truth? Huh? Did y'all expect, of course, I think you could predict this, that Black Lives Matter and all the other related movements would take Trump out. You could predict that because the dummy had made so many mistakes And, in the handling of COVID, his base didn't think so, but everybody else did. And these young people were so creative. They got out there and skinned him in so many different ways. And so this, given the circumstances that we're in now, enabled us to do our thing. And the mandate for Black studies or Africana studies is to encourage creativity among our youth, among our young people. I'm not into so much critical thinking. I'm not knocking it, but I'm not so much into that. I'm into creative thinking, because it's easy to be critical, but it's okay. I'm not against it. I'm just not in it, because you can pick something apart, critique it, show what's wrong. That's good. But can you create something? That's the real challenge. And the real challenge is to recreate ourselves and to recreate the societies in which we live. That's the real challenge. And miseducation, Eurocentric education, is designed to kill that. So most of our people, and most people that come out of the academy, especially the highly, prized ones, the Ivy League ones, they're functionally illiterate. They know a lot about very little, and they don't question the system. Most. They were trained not to. Barack Obama, they just came up with a book that he and another student in law school was putting together. It was a critique of neoliberalism, but it was never published. So it tells you he saw what was wrong, but he decided to bury it because he knew he had no future in the Democratic Party. Forget about the presidency or a Senate seat. You know what I mean? So he decided, and then signed on to Bill Clinton and all the rest of the stuff. And Black people, the average Black person doesn't know what neoliberal is. It sounds all right, liberal. They don't know what that means. And most of our people that know aren't telling them. That's miseducation. Black studies, Africana studies, has the challenge to unmask the system that we're living under and to think about, get the students to think about alternatives, starting with the basic stuff about their own relationships to each other. So this is real key. So what we have in the 20th century is new power centers emerge in Africa after World War II, in Asia, in Cuba, and an emerging power that is developing inside the United States. Now, what's the basis for this power? This is real key. I want to say this in the movement. We did this, San Francisco Freedom Movement, the Southern Movement, but we didn't go in with the analysis. We didn't have the analysis. And it's out of the situations that a lot of us learn how this power really works. So a major change in Black power relations occur in the United States. And it was always there potentially, but it emerges in the 50s and 60s as a real strong force. We see it in the 20s with the Garvey movement, but barely. And it is the fact that we are located inside a declining world power, and at a certain point, a rising one, but a declining world power, but the most powerful power on the planet. We're located here. This is a key to how you could get Black studies up inside a university that didn't want it. This is key to how you could seize victories that you couldn't seize before. And so this location inside of the most powerful nation in the world puts us in a strategic position as African people because we're inside the house. The Africans on the outside, they have their power, but it's not the same as the African on the inside. What's different? We can change the cultural, political, social, and economic furniture inside the Western house. You know what I mean by furniture? You can change it. It's not going to be easy, but you're in the position to do it. So this is the real key thing. And I'm going to show you when I get into the free speech movement that we gave birth to in the San Francisco Freedom Movement, and then give you some other illustrations of how this has worked in the US. The other feature that complements our strategic position in the United States is our culture. And it is the maturing of our culture, because our culture is given birth during enslavement. But what ends up happening over a period of time at the end of slavery, you have the maturing of this culture. The culture In the art form is in the spiritual blues. In the general culture, it's in the various pieces of Africa that we pull in to our own culture, the spirit foundation of the culture. All Africans draw on spirit as the number one thing in their life. If I'm sitting in a shop getting my feet done, where there's nothing but women, and what are the women saying? Baby, the spirit told me. You hear me? Huh? My best decisions have always come when the spirit told me. When the FBI denied me a teaching credential, I'm going to challenge it. Halfway to Sacramento, the capital of California, the spirit said no. I turned around. I didn't know why, but 3 years later, they got me out at San Francisco State. You hear me? Usually, if you ignore this spirit, you're in trouble. You hear me? And so that is the sine qua non of all African culture, spirit. And what's the next one? Family. You hear me? If a brother slam dunks, what does he say? Thank God and thank my mama. If he gets a big contract, what does he do? He buys a house for his mama, and he doesn't buy her some little old raggedy house. He buys her a house. Shaq O'Neal with his big old 7'1" self. His little mama comes in, he gets all meek. Yes, mama. Yes, mama. Big old brother. You know what I mean? Huh? Mama, second. You hear me? Father, too. Just ain't many fathers that people can identify right now due to forces that hit the Black community. And then what else is key? Freedom. Our definition of freedom is different from the European definition. You hear me? Huh? It's different. Our freedom is the freedom to create. Their freedom is the freedom to impose power on others. That's us. You hear me? The freedom to create. That's why the enslaved African was so desirable of getting away and becoming free so that they could do what their destiny, their Ka, their Ori said they were put here for. We're all put here on a divine mission. They wanted to, fulfill their own. And notice the greatest amount of inventions occur right after the end of slavery. All that pent-up creativity, So this is real key in the strategic position of Black people in the United States is the culture. And what happens with the strategic position of Blacks in the United States combined with the culture and the way in which the culture works, it inspires other people to go into motion, because one of the key things that our music does, that our movements do, our values do, is that it inspires other people to go into motion. So that a key part of the exercise of power for us is when we exercise our power in a just cause, it creates a chain reaction. And it gets other people to want to do the same thing. And that's a chain reaction, not just with Blacks, but with brown, red, yellow, and white. Note the Black Panther Party. They were the major influence on the American Indian movement. And that's amazing, because the American Indian movement has been in resistance since the beginning of the presence of anyone trying to take this country, that we could inspire them. The Brown Berets, inspired by the resistance movement, again, of the Black Panther Party. And in the case of the San Francisco Freedom Movement, white students, at the most prestigious university in the world, in that they produce more Nobel laureates than all of the Ivy League colleges put together. And we radicalized them, not intentionally. I'm not going to tell you we had the great insight to know that when we got them in motion and we got them arrested for a year, they come up radical, some of them. You understand? Because of our ability to create chain reactions. Look how many people went into motion around the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor motion. 50 states and 50 countries around the world. You want to talk about chain reaction? That's some chain reaction. Now, if you put it in an area where you can produce results, you're going to get some real good results. So the Black Freedom Movement in San Francisco was an example of how this power worked. And the key thing is within both the Black Freedom Movement in the South and the Black Freedom Movement in San Francisco, and there were others, but we're the only ones that had across the board success, is that we came up with methods that worked. And the Black freedom movement in the South came up with methods that worked. And that's the real key thing in exercising power, is to come up with strategies that are suited to produce particular results. King's strategy in the South was the boycott, which he didn't come up with. That was a community decision. That was the Montgomery bus boycott. His other strategy was the strategy of putting people in motion in places like Birmingham, where you had a bull counter that looked absolutely crazy with dogs suck on people. And that embarrassed the government and got him civil rights legislation. And in the case of the Raymond Pettis Bridge, where people are attacked by state troopers, and I was there, I was Marshall, got arrested there. That produced voting rights legislation. So that was a method that worked for him. That method wouldn't work in the North. You can't embarrass the white power structure in the North. And a good part of the South now, the issues you're dealing with now, those ingrained issues, moral appeal ain't going to have no effect. You hear me? It's going to have to be straight power. So in the case of the San Francisco freedom movement, the key to its success was we had a variety of strategies that were successful because they were suited to the particular target. And we defeated an entire economic power structure. So we went after industries. I became chair in '63. I sent my people out in the Black communities. This is a reason that the Northern movement wasn't successful generally, is they didn't know the central issue that drove Black people. In the South, it was clear. It was the denial of the vote with segregation. But in the North, we would scattergun. We'd say housing, we'd say education, we'd say employment. Well, some of those issues, if that's the primary issue, it's going to take you a long time to get any results. You know what I mean? Especially education. If you're taking on education, well, let's really talk about it. The police. You hear me? And I think it's good that Black people are taking on the police, but that's a long-term kind of thing. And you're only going to get so many results. And so the people said they wanted jobs. Jobs was what produced the results. And so we found a strategy to take out the downtown department stores. That was a boycott with the churches. We found a strategy, and so that was hundreds of downtown department stores. Once, after 3 months, we put those boycotts on them, we got a lot of jobs. And we took none of them. That was the other thing in terms of our movement. We took on supermarkets. We tried to boycott, but most of the areas where people were going around the Bay Area, they were white. So I came up with a strategy called the shop-in. So you just load up grocery carts and not buy anything. And we nearly put them out of business. And so for 1 year, they had to hire all Blacks and people of color, 1 year. And those are union jobs with retirement, with medical benefit. When I go into those stores now, those people still have those jobs. By the way, the gains we got then, they got now. You hear me? And we had people unemployed who, needed jobs, but it was an unstated rule we wouldn't profit from it. The banking industry, the same thing. The hotel and restaurant industry, the auto dealers. It was industries. We defeated all of them, then organized 45,000 Black people, block by block. These successful movements served as a lesson for students that would give birth to Black studies at San Francisco State. Because what they would say is that what inspired them was a methodology of King, the San Francisco freedom movement, and the spirit of Malcolm. And with us, they found a method. With Malcolm, they found a non-compromising approach. But the key thing to our success was the freeing of the mind. Some of us entered the movement thinking that we knew what we were doing. And me, for one, my favorite saying in my 20s was, I know. You tell me something, I know. You know what I mean? Until I'm having lunch with a good friend of mine who's still around, Norman Brown. Norman's 2 years older than me. I'm 83, he's 85. And Norman is from Zora Neale Hurston's town. It was a place where he never saw a white person until he left there in Florida. went to New York. We're having lunch at Virginia's restaurant. And Norman, I'm a government major. I'm in law school, second year of law school. I'm supposed to know how the government's working. Norman, who has a high school education, smarter than me, a cab driver. Norman is telling me how the government works. And something clicked in my mind. For the first time I could see it. My father was trying to tell me, I didn't get it. It was over my head. But we were dealing with a power structure now. We were engaged with the economic elite, and Norman was telling me they ran the country. Well, that ain't what I learned in government classes. The people run the country. It's a democracy. Black people joined the movement to expand our rights. That was the average person in the Black freedom movement. That's what they thought. And that was the most embarrassing experience of my life, to sit there and I'm saying I know and saying to myself, oh shit. I know I'm in trouble. I thought this education I got was pretty good. It was better than high school. I was in the library all the time. Brandy and I both majored in government. That was the one thing I liked because it was problem solving, it was close to organizing. I didn't know I was an organizer then, but I liked that. But I realized I didn't know up from down. If I didn't know my enemy, I didn't know myself. I'm engaged in an entrenched battle. I'm going to lose, but that ain't why. I was ashamed. It was because I didn't know. It was because I was politically dumb. You hear me? And it caused me to hit the books and to undergo a transformation of consciousness. The same one Malcolm underwent, the same one that Cabral underwent. And that was the key. Had I not undergone that, I wouldn't have been in Black studies because all I knew was white studies. And so this is the process that gives birth to the Black scholarship that drives Black studies at its beginning. All of us trained ourselves outside the academy. Brandy, you can put on the slides, the first one. And so what ended up happening was that the community became the classroom and Black bookstores became the university. And so what you're going to see in a minute here, is some of the things that we had to dip into what Cabral called a return to the source. We had to dig deep into our culture to draw from the knowledge of our people. So in the Africana Studies discipline, people like Henry Highland Garnett became someone that you study. You know what I mean? Go to the next one. Edward Wilmot Blyden. Blyden was key because he wrote a book on African life and customs. It's the most important book. Most people think about Christianity, Islam, and the Negro, but it was Blyden who was the first African from outside of Africa who appreciated how traditional societies were organized and how, had the independence leaders of Africa taken them serious, they would have gone differently. John Hope Franklin. Now, Franklin is not an Afrocentric scholar, but he's dealing with African-American studies, and it was serious, and Du Bois was one of his major teachers. The next one. This right here is J.A. Rogers. And J.A. Rogers was a person who was like the foundation person. So when Malcolm is learning history, J.A. Rogers is the first one he read. For me, my first introduction to a general summary of history, it actually came through another book on African history. But one of the major introductions was World's Great Men and Women of Color. You know, so he's the foundation. That was a foundation that any scholar who's Black has to go through. The next one. Drusilla Dunjee Houston, you know, who wrote the Ethiopian Ancient Kushite Empire. She was an Ethiopianist and a bad sister because she was going back to the roots of African culture. And so in building our knowledge, these are things we had to do. This is what trained us. The next one. W.B. Du Bois, you know what I mean? Du Bois is an interesting fellow. You know what I mean? He was on the one hand a rigorous scholar, but he was a product of his age, an elitist, you know what I mean? Kind of arrogant, you know what I mean? But he cared about Africa, and he convened the first three Pan-African Congresses, the first is never counted, and ended up in Africa working on the Encyclopedia Africana. Go ahead. George Washington Carver, the greatest scientist in the 20th century. Some of us get tired because that's the diet we got. But if you understood the diet that this man consumed, Einstein said he was the greatest scientist in the world. He said George Washington Carver was second. Everybody else said George Washington Carver because he innovated so much stuff, none of which harmed humanity that you can't even count. You hear me? And what was the source of his creativity? His gift from God and the Spirit. He thought God's thoughts. That's what he said. Innovators are 2% in a discipline. He innovated so much you can't count. And he's the key to saving the planet right now. The book that I'm doing now deals with that. Y'all know who this is? The greatest expert on African-American culture, Sister Zora Neale Hurston. One bad sister. You hear me? Her best book was Mules and Men. So in grounding ourselves in the discipline or creating one, you have to pay as much attention to African-American culture as African culture. And then her book on the spirituals and a whole series of others. I've read all her works that's out, and one recently on the last enslaved African. I wanted that picture because that really captures her. Next one. This is the greatest scholar of his time, William Leo Hansberry, who was an expert on Ethiopianism. He didn't have time to write. So the two books that have been published on him are his notes, his lecture notes. But he was one of the best researchers that we had on African history. He was denied a PhD because he challenged his professor at Harvard and at Oxford, because they were writing us out of history, and he proved that Kemet was Black and everything else was. The next one. John Henry Clark. I apprenticed under him for a good 20 years. He was my buddy. We spoke a lot on same platforms. He encouraged me and supported me in the writing of my book on the political legacy of Malcolm X, as he had written a book on, or edited a book on Malcolm X, the Man of His Times. And he wrote one of the two introductions of my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. This is one of the sharpest minds we had, and one of the kindest human beings you'd ever run into. Next one. The bad boy in African scholarship, Dr. Joseph Ben Jochannan. Dr. Joseph Ben Jochannan loved to insult people, not so much Black people, but he was a bad boy, you know what I mean? But he was totally dedicated to ancient Kemet and did all kinds of writings on Kemet, and he was a close friend of Professor John Henry Clark. Next one. Sheikh Anta Diop, who was the master of Afrocentrism, who all followers of the African-centered thrust come under, because he's the one that establishes the Blackness of ancient Kemet. A linguist, a person who was a physicist and historian, and a kind human being. Almost godlike when you talk to Theophil Obenga. He was so nice. Next one. You had to be grounded in him. Dr. Theophil Obenga, his main apprentice, who I hired at San Francisco State. My last interview with John Henry Clark was in his home in 1998. And Dr. Leonard Jeffries had told me that Obenga was looking for a job. I said, Professor Clark, should we hire him? I mean, I already knew the answer, but you got to ask your elders. He said, yeah. I called up Wade Nobles, who was acting chair then, and I gave him the reasons why we should hire him. He said, I don't need any reasons. Get him out here. And then I got him more money than anybody else at San Francisco State ever got. And when someone in another college, well, within the College of Ethnic Studies, voiced criticism of that, I stopped his career. Because if you're going to oppose a person that speaks 10 languages, written 17 books, is an archaeologist, paleontologist, linguist, and historian, shame on you. You hear me? We talk regularly. He just, as an advisor to the president of Congo Brazzaville, got built a university in Congo Brazzaville, grounded in Afrocentrism. You hear me? They just opened it. Right now it enrolls 10,000 students, but they plan to expand it to 50,000 off of African money. Next one. This is John Jackson. John Jackson, one of the real giants of Africana and African history. A lot of these, like John Henry Clark, John Jackson in particular, these are people that laid the foundation for the intellectual scholarship of Black studies. His introduction to African civilization is a classic. And by the way, the man didn't believe in God. He was atheist and was proud of it. But he was about as godly as you get in terms of his character. And he was a teacher of John Henry Clark. The next one. Now, this was my master here, Dr. Jacob Carruthers. You see that face? You see the kindness in there? Look at those eyes. Little guy with a deep voice. Absolutely brilliant. I call Jake, as he called himself, Jake from Chicago. They now named the Center for Inner City Studies in Northeastern University, which is a special building they have, the Center for Jacob Carruthers Studies. He is one of the two best people on ancient Kemet, along with Obenga. A humble person and a brilliant person. Next. Martin R. Delaney, the most brilliant, one of the two most brilliant minds we produced in the 19th century. And this is a picture of him. He was the highest ranking Black in the Union Army, a major and a medical doctor, but an advocate of Black nationalism. And if you're going to understand Garvey, you got to understand that Garvey grows out of the Delaney roots, who called for Africa for the Africans. Those at home and those abroad for Garvey, Africa for the Africans for him. And was a major planner of the strategy for the Civil War, that is to force Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Next. This is the Deacons for Self-Defense and Justice. I couldn't find a picture of Chilly Willie, and I carry around his card in my pocket. His legal name was Ernest Thomas. But Chilly Willie, he's 6'1", black as midnight. The sisters would faint in his sight. You hear me? And he was the person that was hooked up with San Francisco C.O.R.E. And when I was in Bogalusa, Louisiana, I was dealing with the Deacons. So this is the self-defense movement coming out of the South that partnered with C.O.R.E. Go ahead. Bob Moses. Now we're getting into the leadership here. Bob Moses was the best organizer in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He trained Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and in fact picked him to pick the students that would make up the Mississippi Summer Project. He was a mathematician, eventually got a PhD in mathematics. He was an apprentice of Ella Baker's, and his successes were due to his drawing from African-American culture, his humility, and his subscribing to group-centered leadership. Go ahead. Again, Bob Moses. He ended up working in Tanzania. When we worked in the Ujamaa villages, I got to meet him. He died just a short while ago. He ran an algebra project in Mississippi for years. Go ahead. Ella Baker, one of the two best organizers to come out of the 60s, Malcolm the other. And I don't think you could say one was the better than the other because she was into group-centered leadership. Malcolm built the best disciplined organization, the Nation of Islam, and didn't have the chance to build his own. But Ella Baker was a deep thinker. She was a situational revolutionary. She didn't have a prescription for A to Z on revolution. It was situations. She was beautiful. Next. This is the March Against Fear in Mississippi, the Meredith March. And you have King, the national director of C.O.R.E, Floyd McKissick, who I picked. I led the Black nationalist wing in C.O.R.E, and P.A.P.O, someone's major influence that's on this show today. So this is the big three: SNCC, C.O.R.E, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And this is where Black Power was born. Malcolm was key in terms of developing consciousness in the movement because he was the most advanced of the leaders, and he had the biggest influence on the Black consciousness of the movement. But the movement had a big influence on him. And C.O.R.E, of all of the movements, had the biggest because they were where he was. For example, his speech, Ballot or Bullet, was delivered in two places. One was in Detroit before a group called the Gold, the Henry brothers. And then the other one was in Cleveland before C.O.R.E. And so he had that kind of interaction, but he was the most brilliant mind that Blacks politically, the most brilliant political mind Blacks produced in the 20th century. And if there was going to be a strike at state without his spirit, it wouldn't have happened. Next. This is showing King and Malcolm. I like this picture because you usually see the other one where they're both grinning. And in the background is King's lieutenant, Ralph Abernathy. King had a lot more respect for Malcolm and Malcolm for King than you would guess from their public statements. And in the end, they were both supporting each other on the human rights position. Next. This is King in Birmingham. And I wanted this particular picture because this was King's best planned operation, Operation Confrontation. It wouldn't have happened except for James Bevel's, because Bevel's was the one that could turn out the students. And other than that, older Blacks were too afraid to demonstrate. This campaign produced civil rights legislation. Next. Rosa Parks, and then King on the side. The stereotype of Rosa Parks is she just got tired and refused to give up her seat. The reality of her was she was a militant almost her whole life. Her family had been Garveyites. Her favorite leader was Malcolm X. This was a nice lady, but you didn't mess with her. Next. Fannie Lou Hamer, and that's her addressing the Democratic Convention, where the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee tried to challenge the Mississippi delegation and wanted to be put in place of it. And at this presentation, which Johnson overruled by calling a press conference so that people wouldn't continue to watch her, she said, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." She also said, "I didn't come here to get one or two seats." This was a non-compromising spiritual freedom fighter. The next. Black Panther Party. No strike at San Francisco State without the Black Panther Party, because the students at State were heavily influenced by the party. Remember, the strike occurs in '68. This is a period where the Panther Party is peaking. And in fact, the triggering issue that led to the strike was the firing of George Murray. George Murray was a minister of education for the Black Panther Party. And his firing riled the students up. That triggered the strike. George Murray went on to get an EED from Stanford and is a dedicated minister of the gospel. I see him regularly. Beautiful brother. Next. And you know who this is, Assata Shakur, one of the baddest sisters that our movement has produced. And a sister coming out of the New York area who was grounded in African and African-American culture. One of her critiques of the Black Panther Party was that they knew too much about Mao and Marx and not enough about Harriet Tubman, or other Blacks who had engaged in struggle in this country. And she's an expression of that. And to be freed from maximum security confinement through the Black Liberation Army and through the Weather Underground was a major achievement. Next. Toni Morrison, pure creativity. She's the one that got Angela Davis to do a biography when she was too young to have a biography. Angela's humble. I know Angela. She's a Southern lady. She don't have no big ego. She doesn't have an entourage around her. And she said, what do I have to say at 29 or 30 years of age? And she said, well, you got something to say, lady. Toni Morrison, one tough sister, beautiful, creative Black woman. Next. Okay, now we're getting into the San Francisco freedom movement's impact on the student movement. And I think you're going to get into a visual here that's live. And this is the demonstration at the Sheraton Palace Hotel. I'm showing you this because this is where both the free speech movement comes into being and the experimental college at San Francisco State, which was the first teaching of Black studies at San Francisco State, where Sonia Sanchez, Askia Muhammad Toure, and Amiri Baraka taught the first Black studies courses at San Francisco State. That was the embryo for the Black Studies Department and gave the students the inspiration for the strike. I think you're going to pipe into a live feed here. See if it does. Yeah. See if there's any sound on that. Yeah, this is demonstrations at the Sheraton Palace Hotel. Is there any sound?
Let me try it again.
More than any other cause, the civil rights movement became the wellspring of student activism and inspired our entire generation. In 1960,
this is the Sheraton Palace demonstration.
Began to band together with Black activists to protest discriminatory hiring practices of Bay Area businesses. We sat in at restaurants.
Sister with the glasses, Tracy Sims.
Showrooms. Our biggest challenge came when we tried to secure jobs for Blacks and other minorities in the hotels of San Francisco. A picket line formed around the Sheraton Palace while negotiations with the Hotel Owners Association took place inside.
It was getting to the point where we were saying we are going to create a confrontation. We're going to create a situation that's intolerable and we're going to force you to respond to it in some way. And we're willing to get arrested in order to do it. And now the ball's in your court.
All of this in this elegant lobby, I can't convey to you the effect. It was like the riffraff coming to the White House or something, and the real democratic masses.
This is a former UC Berkeley student.
No, you cannot continue to run this hotel in this racist fashion. The world is being redefined. Things cannot continue on that way. They just won't.
We just entered into discussions with the Sheraton Palace for
That's
the past
me.
8 hours. And we were given a 7-page document which was supposed to summarize the agreement, but it seemed that there was only one hitch. The Sheraton Palace wasn't willing to sign.
Okay.
Okay, so this right here, these are students who came from UC Berkeley and San Francisco State to demonstrate at one of the last of the three big demonstrations, San Francisco Freedom Movement, against the hotel and restaurant industry. And as a result of that, what we ended up having was the free speech movement and the experimental college that gives birth to Black Studies. Is there anything else in there? That's it?
That was the last slide, yes.
Okay. So what ends up happening is Black Studies comes out of this. And so the students at San Francisco State in '68, after the experimental college, then began to put forward demands for the creation of a Black Studies department. Nathan Hare had been brought in earlier and had created a curriculum for Black Studies. And what ends up happening is they get bounced around from administrator to administrator with nothing happening in the creation of a Black Studies department. So they went on strike. And so what the students did was use the technique learned from the Southern movement, which was the march. And then they used some hit and run tactics that they got from the War of the Flea, a book called The War of the Flea, written by a guy named Tabor, where they would run water and stuff and, you know, just try and mess things up on campus. And a boycott. They used the boycott to pull students out of class. This was an over 8-month struggle that eventually gave birth to the Department of Black Studies and the College of Ethnic Studies. Ethnic Studies comes in because students of color supported this campaign. And so they asked that their demands be included. Normally, when you're in a coalition, you run it and it's just your demands. But the students conceded, the Black students conceded to that. A College of Ethnic Studies made up of Asian American, Native American, and Latino studies and Black studies was formed, with a College of Ethnic Studies that housed us, which was good because we're not coming up under another unit. And so that was the creation of Black Studies. And so in the first years of Black Studies, it was implementing that curriculum. Nathan Hare was lost because the students had accepted an offer from Hayakawa, who was a right-wing administrator, a Japanese American, who became a conservative senator later. And he gave them an offer of nearly 12 full-time positions. That's more positions when you add them up times 5 times 12 than we would ever fill at San Francisco State. The students went for it. And then what happened is the union was on strike of faculty at the same time. And when the students then conceded and was willing to accept what was a good offer, then the faculty accused them of selling them out. The students then went back on accepting the offer. And as a result, the faculty continued to demonstrate until they got their demands met and left the students high and dry. You hear me? And so the next time the students went back to try and get their demands met, it was only going to be, and I think had the students held out, they could have prevented this from happening. They were only going to get these nearly 12 positions if Nathan Hare was not included. And so Nathan Hare was cut out of the picture. The first person I hired when I became chair was Nathan Hare. The person I tried to get tenured was Nathan Hare. For various reasons, it didn't happen. But the point is, this is the history of Black Studies at San Francisco State. It was a product of the Black Freedom Movement. Many of the students said that the spirit of the strike was Malcolm, the methodology was King, and the Black Freedom Movements, including the one in San Francisco, but especially the one in the South. And so it was that militancy that produced the department, and it was through that that the department continued to grow and move through various stages. So I'll conclude on that, that the creation of Black Studies inside of a white university is clearly an example of strategic power being exercised by Blacks. Because of our strategic position, young people who believed they could do anything. And most of the elders would probably think that was not possible, believe that you could actually put a hybrid up in there, an alternative, if it operated right, up inside the academy. Of course, the academy has tried to frustrate that and create as much Oreo studies as they could. And in some cases they have. But for those who are stuck to the course, it's the creativity of these young people. I walk the strike every day. I didn't lead it. And by the way, had I led it, I would not have been able to take a job because I don't profit from any movement I lead. So I'm glad I didn't lead this one for a lot of reasons. But it's to them that we owe the creation of this department and visionaries like Dr. Nathan Hare and the movements of Black Power, movements of the Black Freedom Movement, and the subsequent movements that follow. So Hotep.
Thank you so very much. I know a few people had to hop off to other meetings, as did Dean Mara, but she wanted me to tell you thank you so much, and she looks forward to watching the rest of the recording. So I want to open up for any questions or comments that anyone would like to offer. You've given us so very much tonight and so many things to think about, but there may be some comments that folks would like to make or questions to ask. Anyone? Okay, Kwame, please go ahead.
Thank you for an amazing talk and a lot of knowledge. I don't want to make this a talk that's too much about technology, because that's just not where I want to go with this. But could you talk a little bit about surveillance? And when you think about surveillance in the past and in the present, surveillance and just like, our ability to connect, but also to be aware of the kind of surveillance that goes on in this environment, teaching the kinds of things that we teach. Thank you.
Yeah, and now with the movements now to restrict, and in some cases in the teaching of Black studies, and restricting the content of it, and particularly the governor of Florida, who has been able to impose on that. That is, on the one hand, I think, and so there's going to be probably more surveillance because they're going to be looking at excuses for coming after you. You know what I mean? And this is in part a move on their part to get reelected. I mean, this is popular with the sector of white people. So that's part of it. Part of it is it's a part of a cultural war that's false, but it's been turned into something that's supposed to be real. And it's based on the shifting demographics of the United States, where in the next 20 years or so, a majority of the people in this country are not going to be white. And so there's a struggle for controlling the paradigm that is taught in the public schools and at the university level. Not hardly anything Black is being taught at the public school level. There ain't no Black studies department. There was only one that I know of in the 60s, 70s, or 80s. That was at Berkeley High School. So a lot of this is false stuff. So I think that in terms of surveillance academically, we have to be prepared for it. It's happening. A lot of it is not surveillance, it's distortion. And they're creating a distorted view of what we're doing. And so I think it's very important. You're fortunate to have a chair that's an organizer. It's very important that people in the discipline not only are good scholars and know their stuff, but are able to defend their position against attack. And if you're fortunate, as you are in your department, to have one, and there may be others that have the strategic skills, then use them appropriately. Because a lot of the losses come from not knowing how to fight. So we have to be fighters at the same time that we're teachers. Everybody may not be. So if the people who are leading the fight leading it, support them. You know what I mean? I think that's the key thing. Now, in terms of surveillance on another level, which could be the counterintelligence program, which could be the low intensity program, we need to understand that today, while COINTELPRO is still in effect, low intensity operations is the real name of the game. How many of you know what low intensity operations is? Raise your hand. Okay. 2 of the 3, or 2 of the, yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4. My book, The Art of Leadership, Volume 2, covers it. It is an attempt to suppress on a low level. So when they come after you through low intensity operations, you don't see it. And so it's sophisticated. It's basically a move to stop anything before it happens. It's designed to take things to a higher level than COINTELPRO. That was brutal. It assassinated people, imprisoned people, denied them work, sent them into exile. But this one is one that was designed by a man named General Kitson, who was a brigadier general in the British Army. Now, when you look at authors, always look at their qualifications. We're always looking at the PhD. No, look at how effective they are. This guy was very effective. He suppressed the Mau Mau movement in Kenya. He suppressed the Malaysian independence movement and went up against the IRA, the Irish independence movement, or the Irish Republican Army, but was unsuccessful. No one's been able to suppress them, though they've been in trouble for a long time. So he goes on a retreat to Oxford, brigadier general in the British Army, to lay out low intensity strategies based on what he had learned in suppressing movements for liberation. And he puts that together. Ronald Reagan then takes it to the governorship of California and to the White House. And he put it in FEMA. FEMA. You hear me? Low intensity was run on my organization. Had I not trained myself in it, and it's a key thing here, another thing for Black scholars and organizers. You got to be, as you grow, you got to move from the local to the national to the international. Had I not had international connections, I'd have never learned this. You know, it's through being in Britain in 1974 after the Sixth Pan-African Congress that I find a book called Low Intensity Peacekeeping Operations, written by Kitson. I couldn't buy it in the UK. I came back to my university and took it, and I had it for 20 years until my Babalao told me I had to return it. That's stealing. Not really, it was long-term loan. But I did return it, but I copied it, but I studied it. And so low intensity operations has stages to it, everything else. The goal of low intensity is to stop a movement from getting off the ground. That's the key thing. So when most movements are taken out through low intensity, you don't know it's low intensity, you know. So that's the sophistication of it. And then there's a lot of other things that have been done since then in terms of the cooperation of intelligence and police agencies at the national level with local police. So you have to be aware of those, you know what I mean?
Speaking of which, I know you've all seen Nick's and Christine's petition that's going around to block the university's most present surveillance attempt. So if you feel so moved, please sign. We've got about 200 signatures right now on the petition, but could always use more. So make sure you read.
What's the surveillance attempt that you're dealing with?
Basically corporate spyware on all university computers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And they have said that this is necessary to prevent cyber attacks.
Yeah.
But they have been very, very shady in explaining exactly what data will be collected and who will have access to it and how will it affect academic freedom. So there's some people who are definitely organizing against those actions.
I think it's good common sense to know that anything that's serious shouldn't be done on a computer. You should know that. And don't think that you're smarter than the people that set up the system. Because I know people that think that one of my best students is a computer programmer. I got him the MBA program, and his thing is computer management. He's real good. He saved me from some stuff. I mean, that could have happened to me on, the internet and stuff. But the military has the real technology. If you think you've got the technology, you're kidding yourself. And they can override anything you've got. So you got anything to say, keep it off a line. Keep it off the phone. You know what I mean? Go low level. And I'm not talking anything illegal. I'm just talking smart. Whatever you want to keep to yourself, keep it to yourself. You know what I mean? So, yeah, so I guess that's what you were talking about when you asked the question.
No, I didn't want to get too into the technology. I just was thinking more, like you were saying, on a level of just how it works over time, not necessarily what's happening right now with technology.
The best defense against all these attacks is discipline in an organization, burying your ego, making the right moves. Don't do stupid. And don't be afraid, and don't label people as agents and stuff like that, because the one that you think isn't 9 out of 10 times. It's the one that you don't suspect, and you can't even go blaming them because you ain't got no evidence. You know what I mean? You got to be wide open and careful. You got to be good at screening people. If you're in community organizations, you have to have a security section. But even then, if you're above ground, you're going to be penetrated. Right. That's just it.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Any other questions that anybody would like to ask or comments you would like to make?
Yes, I'd like to thank Oba Shaka for a very enlightening lecture and even more admirable Gab as pure royalty. Thank you for your wisdom today. The way you compared Malcolm with Martin is interesting because you are assigned the spirituality to Malcolm and assigned the methodology to Martin. But I wonder if you could say some more about what is meant by the spirituality of Malcolm, by the movement, and why that would not also be available to Martin as a model, and vice versa. Why wouldn't anyone see Malcolm as also providing a methodology as well as a spirituality, just as Martin did, and probably just as like you were saying, the movement did. On the surveillance, a reggae singer from Jamaica, Ini Camus, said that they don't need no spies. Why? We're not hiding anything. Yeah. If we want to move, we say it on the radio, we write about it, we talk about it, we sing about it. Yeah, we never really hide our intentions. So they wasting money with spies. We could have told them anything they wanted to hear because we're writing about them. They didn't go read our works. Thank you again for today's talk.
In terms of associating King with methodology, and I was giving the example for the strike, Malcolm representing more of the spirit. The reason I'm associating King with methodology and not Malcolm is, and in the San Francisco freedom movement as well, we were in the movement. Malcolm, until he was forced out, was in the nation. He was identifying with the movement more than we knew at the time, and was trying to get the Nation of Islam engaged in the movement. And he was an observer of the movement, was a critic of it, and some of his criticism was valid, and some of it wasn't. His criticism of King being a puppet of whites, house Negro, and all the rest of the stuff, that angered King, and it should have, because Black people made King. White people, by and large, the power elite didn't want King or Malcolm, neither one. You know what I mean? The reason I associate King with the methodology is leading a movement on the ground. King was very conscious of this. In movements for change, you need victories. That was always coming out of his mouth. And after 65, he had no more. That really bothered him. And it's too bad that he couldn't look at what we were doing, because we could have given him some ideas. Because when he got out of the South, those Southern methods just didn't work. It kind of put him in a bind. But the reason that I associate King with methodology is he had methods that worked. That's why. It got results. That's why. Malcolm had strategy at the end. His strategy, his biggest one, was to take the civil rights movement and turn it into a human rights movement and bring the case of Black people before international bodies, the World Court, the United Nations, and other groups. So that was his strategy. And he had wanted, he said, to be a lawyer. It's kind of like a lawyer's strategy. I'm kind of critical of that strategy, by the way. I think it's a right strategy. Don't get me wrong. I think it's right to take the U.S. before the World Court. It's right to take them before the United Nations. But what results are you going to get out of that? I mean, the U.S. controls the United Nations. They created it. The Security Council makes decisions. So you might get the General Assembly to take a position on human rights, but it ain't going to be acted on. And if it was, on what level? I mean, what effect could it have? And if one of the reasons that Malcolm was taken out was because of this, then you've got to really weigh the question of, was it worth it? Though I think in this case, that isn't why he was taken out. I know why he was taken out. That ain't why. But they certainly were opposed to what he was doing, the CIA, the American government. So the question is, when you have a strategy that you put out, the question is, so what happens if you succeed? What do you get? And the question is, what do you lose whether you succeed or not? If a reason for Malcolm being taken out was his threat to the international order, if that was a reason, then the question is, if you're at war and a strategy is going to lead to you losing your best general, is that a good strategy? And I will say this, King Malcolm was not a strategist. He's a brilliant thinker, a great organizer, but strategy, that wasn't his thing. He had some things that were pretty good. And then his problem was he wasn't engaged in the movement. So as a result, you're not going to expect methodology from somebody that hasn't had his feet wet. He was getting his feet wet and he was assassinated. He didn't have time to acclimate himself. But what he saw was deep. Malcolm was a great observer of things. But even observing something from a distance is different from being in it, So the other thing is King and Malcolm converged. They were both revolutionaries. They both reached the same conclusion that America needed to be restructured. They both concluded that human rights was something that we needed. King was more practical because being on the ground. In 65, he had a meeting with his staff. In my show, the Over Tashaka show, I have a show on the revolutionary Martin Luther King, where I interviewed a brother named Menu Ampin. He's the foremost authority on that. His master's thesis was on that. He went to FBI headquarters and went through the files on King. And it's the best piece on that. In 65, King sits down with his staff and says, civil rights movement's over. He said, what we achieved was cheap, meaning it didn't cost the government for anything for the voting rights bill or civil rights bill. But he said, now we've gone beyond civil rights to human rights. And what he meant was a roof over your head, a job, medical benefits, those things that represent powers that people should have, and particularly those things that required the restructuring of the country, he was opposed to capitalism. King was. Malcolm never studied Marx. King did. Malcolm didn't have to. Malcolm reached the same conclusion. So they had converged, and had they both been alive, you would have had some interesting stuff going on there. You know what I mean? And the government knew that, you know. But so, you know, both of them were pretty much in the same bag. Both of them were dedicated to Black people. Both of them did not compromise on the essential issues of Black freedom. Both of them didn't give 2 cents about money. King didn't even want to own his own house. That's carrying it too far, but I understand his point. And when he got the Nobel Prize, he gave all the money to the movement. And you can see how greedy some of his children are, didn't need to go to them. You hear me? So they both placed the people first. Malcolm said when people get too attached to materialism, they forget about their people, you know? So they both had that in common, incorruptible. Now, King had his problems sexually, you know what I mean? He played around and stuff. Malcolm didn't. And so that's a critique of King. But the fact is, on the essentials, they both placed the people first. They both placed the people first. Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for just one more question, and then we have to wrap it up. Is there anybody who would like to ask a final question?
I am so sorry I was late. We need to abolish Black History Month because it's so many commitments. We need to spread this out throughout the year. But Dr. Chaka, thank you so much. This is a huge treat for us. I hope that you'll make it to the NCBS conference next month, so I can invite you out and treat you to a nice meal. My father met Amilcar Cabral when they were in Lisbon. That was part of the Portuguese colonial program to send some folks to Portugal and educate them or re-educate them. And like you, he just absolutely adored good old Amilcar Cabral. I have a brief question. I hope it is brief, or the answer is brief, because I know everybody has to go. Douglas Daniels at UCSB, Black Studies. Douglas Daniels, he was there in the 80s, 90s, 2000. He challenged us once in a graduate seminar with this question regarding the purpose, the objective of Black Studies. He wondered, he was asked, well, challenging us, to determine if Black Studies was an historical intervention, or should it become a permanent feature within Black experience, especially in the diaspora? By historical intervention, it would be a corrective. In other words, an epistemological corrective that would descend upon universities, reconfigure, restore even knowledges that are relevant. And once society had been repaired, and specifically academia, then Black Studies could sort of disseminate, evaporate into other disciplines. So I remember this challenge that he posed to us, and we were too, I think, immature to really tackle it. It would be great to hear an insight from you as a founder of this historical project, if that made any sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. So who would propose that Greek studies be disbanded, or European studies be disbanded when the society becomes more just, or Asian studies, or who would propose that? So I get his point, but I don't think that this is a creation just based on the fact that we're oppressed, and when oppression is eliminated, there's no need for it. One of the things that Cabral made as a point was that the intervention of colonialism and slavery was a project designed to take us out of history. You know, that means making history, and particularly having our interpretation of history prevail, because people always make history, whether it's in resistance or whether it's in societies in which they rule. So the project of Black Studies should be the project of carrying on the history of our people, in this case, teaching it, but also encouraging people to live and practice its best features, its culture, and all the other areas. But I would say this, the big challenge for Africana studies or Black studies is this, at this point. And I'm finishing a book on this. Carter G. Woodson, in his famous book, Miseducation of the Negro, asserted that foretaught the same history, philosophy, culture, literature, politics of the oppressor. We've been put in the position where, I call it being put on remote control, where he said, instead of being told to go to the back of the bus, our education leads us to do that. And if there was no back seat, we would make one, you know? So on one level, the challenge for Black studies or Africana studies is for us in the history, the culture, the discipline that we teach, that it is one that challenges and encourages and provides a basis for our people questioning the society and coming up with alternatives to this just society. But here's, and so in Black studies and its teaching, it's got to be one that takes us out of the subservient position of responding to the master. And we shouldn't see the discipline as primarily one to prepare somebody for a job. That's going to happen. But the primary thing should be that our students gain a knowledge of themselves, a respect for themselves, a love for themselves and their people that they can apply to anything. And I think that's why I could work into Black studies, because I didn't go to college for a job. I didn't have that idea, but that is the way it's set up. The other thing is, I think the challenge for Africana or Black studies is this. Today, we're in a bind. The bind is this, for African-centered studies. African-centered thought, for those that do, because all of them don't. Some of them are straight up Oreo cookie studies. You know what I mean? The challenge is, and the quandary we're in is this. We have African-centered information and knowledge to the extent that we do, those departments that do. And we have a Eurocentric European methodology for teaching it. And that methodology is what puts us in the biggest bind. I'm an innovator. I've innovated 6 fields of thought, 2 of which come through piping into God's mind, by the way. And people consider that spooky. See, in the university, you're trained at the basic best data is primary data, and that's good. And the primary data is the people, if it's current or data that is primary data. But the innovators all come from the intuitive realm. George Washington Carver was somebody that knew botany, and he knew all of the different sciences attached to it. But it was because he could pipe into God's mind, he could innovate something. The highest level of innovation in science, music, or any area, history, whatever, is when through intuitively or through thinking God's thoughts, you are able to see a law of physics. You are able to see a fundamental truth of history. You are able to hear a sound in music, which George Washington, John Coltrane heard through a dream where he heard the droning sound after years of practice, because this only works when you know your field, but you're average. You don't get to be above average until God intervenes. And see, that people say, bull, well, look at the periodic table in chemistry. Where did that come from? A dream. You hear me? George Washington Carver had so many interventions that you couldn't count them, all for the good of humanity. So that's one thing. But the key thing is this: all of us won't do that. But what we have to do is have a method, or what they call pedagogy, that is one where you are not simply a recipient of information and a feedback specialist. And that's basically what Western education is. Paulo Freire called it the banking system. They drop information on you, you feed it back. And we can play with it and call it African-centered and colorize it and chocolatize it and blackenize it. It's the same method. And you end up with people who aren't creative or who are turned off to education. And so the real challenge, and this is the one that I got one, baby. You hear me? I got one. It's a method where you bring out what is within, not put in, and call that education. And that's the real challenge. And when you're able to do that, then you're able to encourage people to be their full creative self. The hell with what the system thinks. And that's the joy in life. Brandy there is happy because she manipulated this system so she could do what she wants to do. Ah, smart. But when you're coming in a square peg in a round hole, you know what I mean? It's dissatisfying, it's frustrating. And in the end of your life, it's useless. So that's the challenge. And that's not just a challenge for African-centered studies. That's a challenge for studies, period. Put it another way. Western education, at best, can teach you, as Socrates said, and Pythagoras, to be a lover of the truth or a lover of wisdom. That's not bad, because the university just generally doesn't even encourage that. But the real challenge is to be the truth. How do you do that? How do you do that? That's the question. I got the answer. You hear me? I finished 660 pages on this already. It's a 25-year project, but I've been doing it. I don't write anything until I practice it. And this one comes from the realm of practice. And so I think that's the challenge. And you'll find the average student, that's their complaint. Their complaint is, all they do is drop information on us. My wife's son, Kojo, brilliant young man, straight A student, academic, athletic scholar. He had a chance to go to Oxford, where his grandfather went. He's from Barbados, first Black person to be an architect in his country, but already could build a house. They took him to Oxford. He said, Mama, I don't want to be a white boy. Huh? But his complaint was, all they do is drop stuff on us. This is your average brilliant Black person, or white, or brown, or red, or yellow. The average one. You're a genius within the realm of your gifts. You know? And so that's really, the question is, how do you do that? That's the question for me. And Africana Studies is an ideal place for doing that. The other one is, how do you transcend the boundaries set by the European Academy? You can only do that if you've done that yourself. You know what I mean? Transcend that. That's a revolutionary mandate. You know what I mean? That's when you're really challenging. So.
Well, thank you so much, Baba. I cannot tell you how much I have enjoyed all of your wisdom and all of the time that you've given us this evening. We really, really appreciate you for sharing with us and hope to invite you back to do so again. There will be a replay of the recording on Saturday morning for the students who could not join us tonight. So I know that they will be excited about this as well. Anything else that we need to take care of, Polina, Biko, Kwame, before we close it out here? No?
No, thank you so much for the help, Brandy,
Of course.
in this event.
Of course.
Yes, thank you.
That's
Thank
been
you.
so
Thank all
great.
of you.
I could listen to you all night. There is so much that I get from the wisdom that you share, and look
I
forward.
get the same from you, lady.
Oh, thank
And
you.
I'm sure I get the same from everybody else here.
Thank
This is
you.
one sharp sister right here.
Thank you
I
so
know you all are too. I just don't know you.
much.
She's sharp. You can't put something over the wool over her eyes. Weighing and balancing.
Balance.
Is that right, Brandy? Weighing and balance.
That's exactly right. But thank you all again. Appreciate you for being here, and we will see you next time. Have a good rest of your night, everybody.
Right on. Thank you.